Another topic that will lead us into the rest of the organ systems this semester is the idea of membranes. Now, very generally speaking, a membrane is a sheet, right? It's often made up of molecules such as the plasma membrane of a cell or the basement membrane that you find between ET and CT. It can be made of cells. It can be made of tissues. Membranes are found at different levels of the biological hierarchy. But right now, what I want to focus on is two very particular membranes that are found in your body: mucose membranes and serous membranes. We're going to begin with mucose membranes, which are also called mucosa. So mucosa, written up here, is a singular noun. If you want to make it plural, you add an E. So mucous membranes, right? That's easy to make plural, are mucosae. Okay, mucous membranes then are the membranes that line body cavities that are open to the outside world. So this is not lining the coelom, not an internal body cavity, but an open body cavity. And where do you have body cavities that are open to the outside world? Well, this would be a good place to pause and just think it through for a moment. But of course, I have images here to direct you to the four main organ systems: the digestive system, right? Because of course, at both ends, at the mouth and the anus, you have openings to the outside world. The respiratory system, where you have an opening through the two nostrils that then leads to, the airway and all the way down to the lungs. You have the urinary system, where I think the easiest way to think of this one is to start at the urethra, right? The opening to the outside world, and work your way back up. So through the urinary bladder, the ureters, and into the tubes of the kidneys. Those are all going to be lined by mucous membranes. And then reproductive systems. There are many organs shown in both these pictures that are not lined by mucosa, like the gonads, for instance. But if you start at the female reproductive system, start at the vaginal opening and go up through the vagina, into the uterus, and out the fallopian tubes, all that is lined by mucous membranes. And in the male, things are a bit more complicated because it's shared with the urinary system. But here's your external urethral orifice, and again, you follow that back. All of those, of course, are organ systems that we're going to get to later on this semester, but every single one of them contains tubes or cavities at a very small level that are open to the outside world. Therefore, all those organs, if they can be traced to an outer opening, are lined by mucous membranes. They're lined by mucosae. And a characteristic of mucous membranes is that they secrete mucus. So I was very careful about the spelling here. MUCUS, as shown here, is a noun. So secreting mucus, the slimy stuff, to keep the surface moist. Mucose, which we often just pronounce mucus as well, but OUS, that ending is used as an adjective. So it's describing the membrane. Mucous membranes secrete mucus. Why do they do that? Because if the cavity is open to the outside world, then there's a risk of desiccation, of drying out. Think about if you fall asleep in the passenger seat of a car or on an airplane, right? And you end up with your mouth open and you're breathing for a while that way, everything dries out. The other risk with any cavity open to the outside world is potentially infection, right? Because pathogens like bacteria or viruses can get in. So mucous membranes line cavities open to the outside world. Serous membranes, on the other hand, also called serosa, line some of your internal body cavities. So I wrote some certain internal body cavities, not all of them, but they'll line certain internal body cavities and cover certain organs. So serous membranes are not found associated with those cavities that are open to the outside world. On the other hand, serous membranes are found associated with the coelom. And whereas mucous membranes secrete mucus for moisture, serous membranes instead secrete something called serous fluid. And it's quite watery compared to mucus. And in this case, it's used for lubrication. So in order to understand how serous membranes work, let's take a look at 3 examples here. You'll notice that in all 3 cases, the specific serous membrane has a different name, but let's not worry about that right now. For now, know that the dark blue line is the serosa. And so you see it associated with the heart, associated with the right lung and the left lung, and associated with a number of viscera in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And in all cases, you can see that there's a part of the serosa that's lining a certain internal cavity, and then there's another part that's covering a certain organ. For example, up here, the picture around the heart, you see this outer layer, which I'm tracing over in green, is the part lining an internal cavity, in that case, the pericardial cavity. And then this other part, which I'll trace in purple, is covering a certain organ, in this case, the heart. And you could do that again. Boy, I'm gonna have to be so precise over here. Covering the right lung, or this part covering the left lung. Oops, I went into the cavity a little bit. If I switch back to green, lining the right pleural cavity, lining the left pleural cavity. And then again, where it's more complicated down here, the green would be the part lining this, or out here, or out here even, skirting over there. And then the part that's covering certain organs includes this around the liver, this part around the stomach. Okay, so again, without worrying about any of this very particular vocabulary and all these labels, we'll get to that. But first, I just want you to see that the serosa includes parts that line certain cavities and parts that cover certain organs. And the part on each side, they don't actually touch each other. They come very close, but they don't touch. They leave a very thin space, which actually is the cavity. So in this picture, it's the pericardial cavity. Here, it's, well, they've labeled the left pleural cavity, but there's also one on the right pleural cavity. And then down here, it's called the peritoneal cavity. The light blue that is shown in each of those cavities represents the serous fluid. And they've even said that, with serous fluid, with serous fluid, with serous fluid. So that watery serous fluid acts as a lubricant between the two layers of serosa, so that as the organs move, whether it be the heart beating up here, or the lungs inflating up here, or perhaps the stomach, right, expanding at Thanksgiving or something like that. In all cases, as the organs move, the layers of serosa don't rub against each other, like I'm rubbing my hands right now, and make friction. Imagine if your heart beating all day, every day, if you had two membranes rubbing against each other, the heat that would build up from that friction. Doesn't happen thanks to the serous fluid secreted by the serosa. Now that we understand how these two membranes function differently, let's look at how they're structured differently. We can compare and contrast. As a point of comparison, both these membranes are made of two layers of tissue, an ET and a CT. Of course, the ET faces the free surface, and then there's a basement membrane, which I didn't write here, but that's standard, right? A molecular basement membrane, and then there's an underlying CT. In both cases, you can see right away that the underlying CT is areolar CT. And that probably doesn't surprise you when you remember that it's very well vascularized and therefore great for metabolically supporting the ET, which is going to be avascular. What is that ET? Well, in a mucous membrane, all we can say for now is that it varies. And you already actually know this, right? The ET that lines the oral cavity is going to be different than the ET that lines the nasal cavity. And that's going to be different than the ET that lines the urinary bladder. So the ET in each mucous membrane has to vary. It depends on the function of the particular organ it belongs to. But in serosa, it doesn't vary. In serous membranes, the ET is always simple squamous ET, and it even gets a special name. It's called mesothelium. Mesothelium simply means the simple squamous ET of a serous membrane. So every single serous membrane, whether it's located associated with the pericardial cavity or the pleural cavity or the peritoneal cavity, it's always built out of the same stuff. So the next logical step is that we need to dive into those specific names. So what does it mean to be a serous membrane associated with the heart compared to the lungs, etc.? And we will get there. The names of serosa vary by location. But before we go there, I want to pause here, maybe commercial break style, and talk about an exercise that I think will be really helpful for you to start preparing for the cumulative final exam, which I know seems like a million years away. And in a sense, yes, it is. We have a lot to cover before then, but we also know that time is strange and it will be upon us before we know it. So one of the things I want you to be thinking about all the time we go along through these systems is the patterns that are repeated. The patterns are what I'm going to be testing for when it comes to the final exam. And this represents one of those patterns, right? The idea that there are mucous membranes and serous membranes. So have that in mind. But to go even a step further, I would recommend that you take a few blank pieces of paper that you just have with you at all times, maybe tucked in the back of your anatomy notebook, where you can jot down lists. So for example, you can start with a list of membranes, right? What's the pattern? The pattern is, what does it mean to be a membrane? And what are all the membranes that you know so far? The membranes that you've learned in this class. So go ahead and make that list and bring it with you and talk to your peers, and we can talk about it as a group as well.